It's the Acting Income Podcast with Ben Hauck, episode 32, How to Act in New York City with No Income, with Mandy May Cheetham.
It's the Acting Income Podcast with Ben Hauck. Turn your passion into income, Ben will show you how. With all the resources that you need to make it as an actor in an expensive city. To stay balanced and make money, you really can't go wrong with actingincome.com.
Welcome to the Acting Income Podcast. I'm Ben Hauck, your host of the podcast that covers acting, making money, and staying balanced, especially in expensive cities. I'm so glad you found this episode. If you're new to the podcast and haven't subscribed, pull up iTunes or your podcast's app and click the subscribe button. You'll get episodes right as they come out. This is episode 32, titled How to Act in New York City with No Income, with Mandy May Cheetham. The show notes for this episode have all the important links referenced in today's show, which you can pull up right now at actingincome.com/episode 32. And now, here's a word from today's sponsor, my book, Longform Improv. You might be thinking of getting my book, Longform Improv, The Complete Guide to Creating Characters, Sustaining Scenes, and Performing Extraordinary Heralds, but you haven't yet. I thought it'd help you make the decision to get it. Besides being published nearly a year before the Comedy Improvisation Manual, Longform Improv puts some unique spin on improv so that you learn it faster, making improv pretty much logical, not some mysterious art form whose rules are divined from masters. And to give you a glimpse inside, here's the chapter titles: Longform Improv, Rules versus Principles, Comedy, The Structure of Plays, The Structure of Heralds, Getting Comfortable, Getting Creative, Playing Characters, and Exploring Relationships. That's just the first section of the book. The second section has chapters titled The Longform Improv Tradition, The Longform Improv Code of Ethics, Endowing, Yes-anding, and Justifying Seeming Inconsistencies. I want to share more of the chapter titles, and I'm a little short on time, so take a free look inside the book by visiting actingincome.com/LFI, and if you like what you see, get the book for your Kindle or a hard copy for your hands. Again, to get a copy of my book, Longform Improv, visit actingincome.com/LFI. And thanks! Thus far, the Acting Income Podcast has primarily focused on acting in New York City, pretty much because that's where I live. But I also realize that there's acting in other cities, both in the United States and outside the United States. There are actors all over. And sometimes those actors want to move from one market to the other. And sometimes those actors want some advice from other actors who have made that move. And many times those actors are scared of the costs, because usually big city living means big time expenses. That's why my guest today is probably going to appeal to the actor considering a move to New York City, whether that be from a small town in the United States or a small town from outside the United States. You see, my guest is Mandy May Cheetham, and she's from Canada. And a few years ago, I had the pleasure of meeting her and working with her in NYC. She came to NYC for a short stay with no ability to make money while in the city because she was Canadian. How on earth did she do it? Well, you're about to find out in this interview that shocked and surprised me, and will probably also get your brain working as to how to make the impossible seeming task of funding an acting career with little money possible seeming. If you're serious about making a living in New York City, listen to this episode all the way to the end. Here's Mandy's bio. Mandy May Cheetham is a prolific actress, writer, producer, and rapper who has appeared in over 50 projects in the past 5 years, including national commercials, television shows, features, shorts, plays, musicals, improv, sketch, and stand-up. Mandy trained at the Second City Toronto, Berg Studios in Los Angeles, and the Upright Citizens Brigade Theater and the Lee Strasberg Theater and Film Institute in New York City. You can read Mandy's complete bio in the show notes at actingincome.com/episode 32, and be sure to read her hilarious bio on the Internet Movie Database, which I've linked to from there. And now, brace yourself. Here's my interview with Mandy May Cheetham. Mandy May Cheetham, welcome to the Acting Income Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's great to see you. You're a great, great friend, and we work together a lot. I'm in New York City, and you have spent time in New York City, but you are a Canadian actor, and you've spent time as an actor in Toronto, New York City, and Los Angeles. I want to spin this into perhaps a several-part series on the Acting Income Podcast about how an actor can move to different markets and act with little to no income. I understand that you were unable to make money in New York City when you moved here. Is that the case?
Yes, it is illegal for a Canadiana to work in the United States.
You'd have to jump through a lot of hoops in order to make an income, and you weren't in that position. You wanted to move to New York City, what? To pursue an acting career?
Originally, I moved to New York to study acting. I went to the Strasberg Institute. They had a 6-week intensive course. I also took an intensive course simultaneously at UCB, their level 1 and their level 2.
The Upright Citizens Brigade Theater.
That's the one.
When you moved to New York City, how long were you thinking that you'd be spending? Were you spending it just to take classes and then you were going to go back to Canada? Or were you planning on staying longer?
I planned to stay for 6 weeks. That's how much time I had arranged in terms of having a place to stay. And then I planned within the 6 weeks that I'd get discovered, end up on Boardwalk Empire, be famous, and then just live there happily ever after.
And somehow it all work out.
Yeah, sans Boardwalk Empire.
So when it came to making those decisions, New York City is an expensive city. You're based in Toronto right now. I'm not sure how the markets actually compare as far as how expensive it is to live in each city, but you had to probably think about the money involved and what it was going to cost to live in New York City. How did you figure out how much money you might need when you're in New York City?
Well, when I first decided to go, I had a sugar daddy, and he was going to pay for my school. By the time it was time for me to go, or about 3 weeks away from going to take my course, I no longer had said sugar daddy because he was annoying. And so I had a slight dilemma. How does one afford this New York adventure? So I threw myself and I lost my sugar daddy party and made it a fundraiser and invited all of my friends. I think I felt I needed something like $8,000, or I'm not really sure. I ended up raising like $1,500, I think. It was like pay what you can or $8,000, whichever is easier for you to get into the party. But yeah, I raised $1,500. It was lovely because there were these people that I barely knew that I had met at a play that I was ushering at. And they just happened to have the means, and they sent me an extra $500 because they believed in what I was doing and it inspired them. I got really lucky. I have some great friends.
I'd say you had some pretty good supporters. You had a sugar daddy. In perspective, it sounds funny to say that, but we have sugar parents, and sometimes we have other sugar funders to fund our dreams as actors. So that helps some people into moving to city. So that may actually count as one way to fund a move to a big city with little to no income.
Well, it works if you don't break up with them. But I did, so it didn't work. But I'm very grateful for that relationship because it gave me the courage to make the decision to go. I'm not sure I would have made that decision without any sort of backup.
And you had the resolve to continue onward, and you had the creativity to say, I'm going to throw a sugar daddy party and have friends come, and hopefully they'll fund it. And you also had supporters in that your friends believed in your aim. You were going to go to New York City to take acting classes. So you said that you found a place to stay. Did you stay with a friend, or how did you find a place to stay?
I did stay with a friend. Again, my friends are incredible. I have a couple of friends in New York who are bankers. I met them through my banking friends in Toronto. I stayed with my friend Saher, who has a 1-bedroom apartment, or did at the time, up near Columbus Circle. Originally, I was sharing her bed with her. About 2 weeks in, she kicked me out onto the couch. As we neared the 6-week mark, she was like, it's time for you to kind of go. Your hair's everywhere, and you're eating all my food.
Was it because your school was ending and she said this was the deal, you were going to stay for 6 weeks, or did you max your stay?
I think, we have so much equity with our friends and our family. And as all of us who are performers know, at the beginning, when you first start acting and doing shows, it's really easy to get them all to come out and support you. But then after like the 20th show, you better have some fans because they kind of get tired of it sometimes. It's the same thing with sleeping on people's couches. So the more couches, the better. And I just felt like it was time. She didn't actually say it's time for you to go, but I felt like I'd been there long enough. And it was actually, what year was it? 2011. And there was a banking crisis. She was having trouble with her job, or she'd lost her job and was looking for a new one. And so I knew it was stressful in terms of resources and hydro bills and water and all of that. So I didn't want to overstay my welcome. I ended up moving to Brooklyn. I moved in with a friend, a Canadian I had met at hip hop karaoke. He had an extra room in his apartment in Flatbush, which was an adventure. I had some money at that time because my sort of backup was I had a friend who had a cottage here in Canada, a very large cottage, 6-bedroom place that he rented out. And he was not good with websites and the internet and that kind of thing. So I built him a website and built a marketing program for him in order to catch leads for the cottage. And I organized bookings and sent contracts and talked to his potential clients. I made a percentage of that. So I had a little bit of money trickling in through that.
So you had a little bit of a business going on in Toronto, and that gave you some funds that you could work with when you were in New York City.
Exactly. So it was really interesting. And when I first went down, it was in January. That's the slow season. So I ended up staying in New York for 6 months. I had originally gone for 6 weeks. So the beginning part, I wasn't making a lot of money, but then the bookings start coming in sort of mid-February into March. People are booking for the summer. So that's when I started making money off of that. And that's what enabled me to be able to stay in New York that whole time.
Did you stay in Flatbush for the remainder of those 6 months after the first 6-week stay?
No, I stayed in Flatbush for a couple months. I think he was going to move, or he wanted to get a roommate that could afford to pay proper money because he was giving me a really good deal. And I went to a dinner with my first banker friend. I met another Canadian friend who's become a very good friend of mine. She's a lawyer, and she had a 2-bedroom apartment that she shared with another Canadian friend who was back and forth between Toronto and New York and only stayed in that room 1 week out of the month. So I was able to spend the last month or so at her place, and she was in Stuytown.
It strikes me that you were able to do this and you didn't know what was going forward. It's not as if you had this laid out that you were going to stay in Columbus Circle, then move to Flatbush, and then move to Stuytown. You were faced with being homeless or going back to Canada. How much time did you realize you had before you found a new place? I mean, was it that night you had to set out and find a new place, or were you seeing that your stay was going to be unwelcome, so you started putting out feelers and it was just a matter of days before you found a new place?
It was days. I just was like, okay, I'm a big believer in at the moment of commitment, the universe conspires to assist you. So when I make a decision that something's going to happen and I don't fret about how it's going to happen, it happens. Now, whether you believe that happens because the universe listens to you and then magical fairy dust comes down and suddenly things change, or whether you believe that by focusing on something, you suddenly are more aware of all of the possible answers and then you're able to pick one, or maybe it's a combination of both. I'm not really sure, but I do know that it's worked for me over and over again, that when I get really clear about what the result is of what I'm looking for, that I'm able to find it in a super short period of time. But when I say, I need to move out of here, what am I going to do about it? And I start going crazy trying to determine all the minuscule steps in between point A and point B, it doesn't work because I'm not open to the possibilities that I'm not thinking of.
I imagine that ethos helped in also finding other acting jobs. You ended up staying from 6 weeks to 6 months. That's 4 times longer than you expected. So you filled that time not with just school. We acted together, and that's how I met you. How did you find your acting opportunities? Many actors find acting opportunities online through different casting websites. I don't know, given your financial situation, whether you had access to those or not. So how did you find acting opportunities when you were in New York City?
And I paid for Backstage, and I was on Mandy. I think those are the only 2 I really used in New York. I don't remember getting into Actors Access so much until I got to LA.
So you used Backstage.com and Mandy.com as means to find acting work?
And I found quite a bit of it. I was very, very busy when I was in New York. I did a lot of student films and some theater. I worked at the 45th Street Theater, did an improv show there. I had improv shows through UCB. You and I and a couple of other friends from UCB, we were rehearsing and doing some work just on our improv skills. And then we created the web series, The Infinite Need. We also did the short for the New York Improvised Film Festival, the first one, Actuality, while we were there. So, in that 6-month time period, I think I probably did maybe 6 shorts, along with the web series. I also did a commercial for a charity organization. They offered $100 as pay. I was so worried about screwing up my legality being there that I didn't take the money. I told them to donate the $100 to the charity because I just didn't want there to be a paper trail, and $100 is not worth me never being allowed back in the country.
Similarly, with finding a place to stay in New York City, did a lot of these opportunities also come through networking? You said you used Backstage.com and Mandy.com, but also you were in improv classes and you're working with other actors on these different projects. Did you network?
Of course, I networked. I saw my time in New York as building my network in another city. So I met as many people as I possibly could and have stayed in touch with a lot of them also just to cultivate that network. But the places to stay, they were all Canadians that I stayed with. I met one of them through another friend and the other one through hip hop karaoke. I wouldn't say it was networking specifically for the purpose of networking, but it was like finding my tribe. We all had similar interests and similar friends, and it just sort of worked that way. And it's interesting. It's not that Canadians are any different than anyone else, but when you're abroad and when you're in a different city, you tend to huddle together because we have similar experiences. And it's really interesting being a Canadian in the US in general, because I find Americans don't recognize Canadians would have any sort of immigrant experience in the US. Because our cultures are so similar, Americans often don't understand that we would have any sort of culture shock when we come down to live in the US. We absolutely 100% do. There are a lot of differences between living there and living here.
So that culture shock that you experience as a Canadian helps you bond with other Canadians, which almost led you to the couch surfing to different Canadian apartments.
Yeah, I would say that for sure. You know, most of the people that I stayed with didn't have issues because they were doing very well financially.
Essentially what I'm seeing here is if you have support, and specifically you have financial support, and that's one of the main ways that you're able to fund an acting career in New York City with little to no income. You had a sugar daddy at first, and then you had sugar friends in your party, and then you found Canadian friends specifically who were bankers or who were funded, and they could allow you to stay at their places for almost no rent or for little rent. So that's one way to do it. Now, I'm interested to look at the creativity that you had in New York City. You had little to no income when you were in New York City, other than the outside income that you were generating from back in Canada. How did that affect your creativity, the constraints on money that you had? Did you find yourself more creative when you had less money?
That's an interesting question. I think about that a lot, actually, because I'm still not in a position where I'm wealthy or making a lot of money. I continuously make the choice to not take jobs that are going to support me financially because I don't want to give up my 10,000 hours.
10,000 hours.
By 10,000 hours, I'm referring to the concept Malcolm Gladwell wrote about, wherein after 10,000 hours at anything, you achieve essentially mastery.
Got it.
So I started acting late in life. I wasn't 21 when I started, and so I felt like I had a lot to catch up on and didn't have time to really meander through my learning processes. So it was probably a year, I think, after I started acting that I went to New York to study. And then another year later, I went to Los Angeles because I figured if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it. I'm going to give it everything that I have. So I've been offered jobs since then, like $80,000 a year jobs that I have not taken because I have fought way too hard to get to this point where I give myself permission to follow my dreams. And I'm not giving them up for anything. I will say, though, to answer your question, that I don't think being poor helps with my creativity because when all I can think about is food and shelter, I'm not thinking about the highest, grandest version of myself or how to make this joke funnier necessarily. And I think there's a desperation that comes with that when you go into the room, when you're hungry, literally hungry. I don't have the energy to audition properly, really. But in terms of creativity for living and getting my needs met, 100%. I took some classes in New York, some Meisner classes. I really wanted to try Meisner. I went to the man who was teaching them. He was just getting started. And I used to have a cheerleading business before I started acting. So I ran courses all over the world for cheerleaders and taught gym owners how to market their gyms and market their courses and bring in students. So I went to this man and said, hey, I can do this for you. How about I do some marketing and I'll handle your database for you if you let me take courses for free? And he did. So I studied Meisner for the last 3 months I was there.
So actually one thing that I see, though, is because of the lack of money, you found yourself bartering your services. And that was a way for you to get things in the city when you didn't have the money for them.
Well, I think as actors, and a lot of us transition pretty quickly from being actors into being producers and filmmakers, which you and I did when we created The Infinite Need in New York. we just have to learn to barter because the game that we're in is so expensive to pull anything off that you have to do favors for each other. It's a lot like the mafia. I mean, I've not been in the mafia, but I've seen enough movies, and it just seems like everyone does each other favors, and then you call in your favors when it's time, and you kind of bank favors. That's what I mean about the equity with people. It's really important that when you're starting your career, that you are doing as much as you can for everyone that you meet. You get better at qualifying who you should do favors for as you get deeper into your career, but you need to bank that equity with people so that you can then turn around and be like, hey man, congratulations on getting your show off the ground. Am I in it?
So why did you leave New York City when you did? You said you were in New York City for 6 months. Did you have to leave because you ran out of equity, or did you decide now's the time to go?
I ask myself that question a lot. Why did I leave New York? The financial burden became oppressive. I was staying with my friend. She was lovely, but I didn't know her very well. And I'd only been there for 3 weeks, and she'd given me this finite amount of time where I could stay. And I just didn't have the resources to continue. So I thought, okay, well, I'll go back. I'll make some money. I'll get my visa. That's another thing. One night when I was out in New York with another Canadian artist that I met a lawyer who was working for an organization that helped artists with legal fees. So it was a volunteer organization. I asked if they could find someone to help me with my immigration case. So we had found a lawyer to help with my immigration, and I went home sort of in preparation for that. I still had an apartment in Toronto that I was subletting. It wasn't a complete break. I didn't go to New York with the intention of necessarily moving there. So I had a lot of details I needed to sort out. So I went back to do that with the idea that I would be eventually getting my visa. Unfortunately, that didn't work out very well, the charity lawyer, because I ended up with 2 different lawyers through the charity. The guy that had brought me in to begin with moved out west, got a job somewhere else, and then the organization just didn't really follow up. So because it's pro bono work, some lawyers don't hold themselves to the same standards, and you're definitely not the top of the pile when they're super busy. So I wasn't able to get that done, but I did get started on my visa application, which I still am working on 3 years later.
So the financial situation became oppressive, and basically you said, I'm going back to Toronto. So you had expectations when you were moving to New York City. I'm curious, when you left New York City, had you met your expectations? Had you exceeded them? Had you not met them? What was your relationship with New York City by the time you left New York City?
My expectations are always way higher than what is actually possible in reality, I would say. And I think a lot of actors are like that just because we're dreamers, and I would never want that to change. However, the things that I took home with me were incredible, things that I never would have expected, and so important in terms of my career. I had a really realistic idea of what it means to be an auditioning actor, what it means to be working at a really highly competitive level. Because in Canada there aren't as many actors, there's quite a bit of work. It's a very, very busy indie scene in Toronto. So at that stage, I was still doing student films and doing everything for free. So when I was in Toronto, I was working every week on some project. So when I came back, I had upped my game. Being at Strasbourg and learning from Strasbourg what my headshot should look like, what my resume should look like, how to walk into a room, what to wear to an audition. It's very different how you show up to an audition in New York versus how you show up to an audition in Toronto versus LA. They're all different.
How would you describe the difference between New York and Toronto specifically?
In New York, specifically, women wear heels. They dress up to go to auditions. In Toronto, it's much more casual. I remember coming back to Toronto, I think my first audition, it was a commercial audition, and there were women wearing Uggs and track pants. It was really interesting because I had sort of acclimatized myself to what was going on in New York to come back. But when I came back, I was booking everything because I had that energy.
So you brought that New York vibe with you to your Toronto auditions after you left New York, and you found that you were booking at a higher rate.
Yes. Also, I was trained. When I left Toronto, I had studied at Second City, and I had studied with a private coach who is amazing, Pam Hyatt. She's in her 70s, and she went to RADA and Lambda. And I had basic skills, improvisation skills, articulation, and some of the more technical skills that Pam had. But when I went to New York and I did Meisner and Strasbourg and long-form improv and studied with one of Chekhov's disciples. I mean, when I came back, I was a whole other actor too. And so I had that confidence to know that I could walk in the room and execute. Whereas before I was just making it up, improvising, literally.
So there was a lot you learned when you were in New York City, and that doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, you went to school in New York City, you got to be in this hyper-professional environment, going back to the environment of Toronto. I can understand what you'd learned. Now, is there anything you think you'd do differently? You went to New York City in the way that you did, and you've come back. Now, if you could do it again, do you think you would do something differently?
If I could do anything differently, I would have done more live shows. I would have done more improv. I would have done more stand-up. I did stand-up for the first time when I was in New York also. I think I just would have gotten out more and done more live stuff. I was a little bit intimidated. Again, I'm not going to blame being Canadian on this, but definitely coming from Second City and going into UCB was a huge culture shock too. Because Second City is a lovey-dovey, nice, happy place. I don't know if it's the same in Chicago, but in Toronto it definitely is. It's a beautiful place to grow up as an improviser. When I got to UCB, it was like all of you are up against the back wall, and whomever steps out with the premise wins the game. Basically, you really have to be aggressive in terms of getting out and getting your showtime and getting your ideas out quickly. And wow, was that helpful for me. Learning how to be more competitive as an actor. The other thing I learned in New York that was so incredible was how to cross the street. Everything in New York is a race and a competition. Not for everyone, but that's definitely the way that I felt. And you're walking through Times Square and everyone's going to jaywalk at the same time and there's a car coming. All of you are headed at each other into this collision course in the middle of the road with cars coming at you. And you have to learn to hold your ground and get across the street. If you deviate for any moment or hesitate, you are going to get stuck in the middle of the street. I really think that is a great metaphor for acting in general. When you step into a room or a role, that you make a decision and you follow that course no matter what the outcome. Before I lived in New York, I didn't quite understand that I could do that and still be successful because I had never had a reason to. There aren't as many people on the streets in Canada. When you're acting here, everyone is lovely to each other. In the waiting rooms, everyone is pretty much sweet and kind. Culturally, it's just not as competitive. And going to New York taught me that this is a very competitive industry.
This is the Acting Income Podcast, and obviously we're focusing on acting and money and how to balance it all. Would you have done anything different financially in moving to New York City if you could do it again?
I probably wouldn't have broken up with my sugar daddy.
You would have held on to the relationship longer?
Yeah. Either that or built up the business of renting out the cottages so that it was larger and could sustain me.
Great. Mandy, what would you recommend an actor who is moving to New York City from either Canada or from even somewhere in the States or even somewhere else in the world with little to no income? What recommendations would you have for them?
Firstly, if you can build some sort of online business, it's really helpful to have any type of passive income when you're going to live in another country. My income wasn't necessarily passive, but it was definitely coming still from Canada. So it's a way to work legally without necessarily having to be in Canada. But I think the biggest piece of advice that I would give is if you feel like you need to be there, that you should go. Because like I said, at the moment of commitment, the universe conspires to assist you. And when you decide that it's time for you to be there, you should be there. And actually, Ben, you said something to me when I was there that has really resonated with me too, when I was trying to decide whether to stay or whether to go. And you just said, if you want to be here, you'll be here. That's 100% true. It's been 100% true of anywhere that I've lived and worked.
Mandy, I have this image of your career in New York City of you just got on a vine, and whenever you needed to swing to another vine, somehow a vine would present itself and you'd grab on at the right moment and swing to another vine. And from vine to vine to vine, you end up in a new place in your career.
Are you calling me a monkey?
No comment. Now, Mandy, I understand you have a book that you're working on this very topic of acting life in Toronto, in New York City, and in Los Angeles. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, in my travels, I've met a lot of people who are just starting out, and they always ask kind of the same questions. So I figured I would, in a sense, journal through what my experiences have been in each one of those cities and lay it out practically for how you can get started in any one of those cities, and also to address some of these questions that you're asking about making the move from one city to another. Because, in New York, tons of actors were like, I think I'm going to move to LA, and then LA actors are moving to New York, and Toronto actors are moving to both cities. So I had this experience that I want to share. So it talks about what websites to be on in each city, where's a good place to study, how you can find places to network in each city and grow your business essentially. Some of those differences I mentioned earlier, like what do you wear to an audition in New York versus what can you wear to an audition in LA, and how is that different? And finding agents in each one of those cities. So you're essentially building a career each time you move, a new career.
Where will the book be available? Where can someone purchase the book once it's available?
Yeah, so the book is available on my website, mandymaycheetham.com, and I have articles that I'm writing for Raindance, and they're putting snippets of the book out as part of their blog, raindance.org.
And I put the link to that in the show notes. Mandy May Cheetham, thank you so much for talking to the Acting Income Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Mandy talked of culture shock that Canadian actors feel when coming to the States, and how Americans don't really get it. There was a part of my interview with Mandy that dove a little deeper into that culture shock that I couldn't include in the preceding interview, so I'm including it here. It's on the differences in healthcare between Canada and the United States, and the implications of those differences on creativity and acting income. So if you're coming to the States for your acting career from out of the country, you might want to put aside some extra money for health insurance consideration. I'll admit, there's nothing fun about United States health insurance. Here's what Mandy had to say.
One of the major things I think in terms of culture shock for me was experiencing the healthcare system, because I didn't have health coverage in the United States. So I had to purchase additional healthcare travel insurance when I left Canada. It was stressful having to update that every month as I extended my stay. It was an extra $80, which is not a lot of money in comparison to what Americans have to pay for health insurance, but it was for me for sure at the time. Just knowing that I couldn't just go to the doctor was a real change in my chemistry of the way I lived my life. I felt this sort of layer of fear that I'd never experienced before.
I can imagine that. I can see why that would be culture shock.
Yeah, it actually helped me to understand American culture in a way that I never did before. In particular, when I got to LA, I can talk more about that next time we speak about it. But even you, Ben, I remember we had a few conversations about your situation and why you worked doing things that I didn't feel like were in line with who you are as a performer. And I didn't feel like it was honoring you as a performer because you're so brilliant. And I was like, why are you doing whatever other work that doesn't have you front and center and the star of the show? And you would say, well, I need to continue with my benefits and I need my health care and like I have to survive. And like it didn't make any sense to me because even if I don't have any money, I always know that I have a couch I can sleep on and I never have to worry about health care. And that has a huge impact on your life. And probably one of the reasons I take the risks that I do in my life is because I grew up in such a safe space.
A safe space. It can be a bit scary coming to New York City, not only from another U.S. city, but especially from out of the country, where things might operate a little bit, or a lot of bit, differently. To help make it a safer space for you as an actor starting out in the big city, as you recall, Mandy put her experiences in New York City, Los Angeles, and Toronto into a practical book, and I want to plug that one more time. You can get a copy of it from her website, mandymaycheetham.com. That link is also in the show notes. Mandy thanks to Mandy May Cheetham. Oops. Many thanks to Mandy May Cheetham. And that's the show. This episode was sponsored by Longform Improv, the complete guide to creating characters, sustaining scenes, and performing extraordinary heralds by Ben Hauck. To get a copy of Longform Improv, also available for Kindle and Nook, visit actingincome.com/LFI. The show notes for this episode are available at actingincome.com/episode32, where you can also leave a comment on this episode. You can also find Acting Income on Twitter and Facebook. If you have a story idea, visit actingincome.com/pitch. If you'd like to advertise in the show, visit actingincome.com/advertise. And if you love the content of this podcast, please tell other actors with a review of this podcast on iTunes at actingincome.com/iTunes. I'm Ben Hauck, oh Canada. And for more information, as always, check out actingincome.com. My. Here's a little bonus for listening all the way through this episode. In the interview, Mandy referred to a little web series we did when she was in New York. It was called The Infinite Need, and it was a fully improvised web series all about casting director workshops. The premise was, one actor visits one casting director 9 different times, and we wanted to show what could happen in these things and how much money an actor can shed in the process of getting a casting director's attention. In fact, the first episode is modeled in part off of one actual casting director workshop Mandy attended. So, as a bonus, I'm going to play the audio for you of episode 1 of The Infinite Need. And if you want to watch the things you can't see, just visit theinfiniteneed.com to watch the whole web series, which was repeatedly called hilarious and painful. I agree. Here's episode 1 of The Infinite Need.
Yeah, let's get like that report or something like that. How you doing? How you doing? Well, if you go for some redhead or something. I don't know. It doesn't need to be a name. Just anybody. Anybody. Yeah. Just scan your drawers or something like that. Great. All right. Talk to you later. Bye. Thanks. Hi. Hi. I'm Scott.
Oh, hi.
Scott Barron Worth. Nice to meet you. What's your name?
Betty Moore.
Betty Moore. Nice
Yes.
to meet you, Betty. I don't think I've heard of you before. Do you have a headshot or something?
I do. Would you like me to close the door?
Oh, yes, please do. Hope you don't mind. I have to keep my cell phone on. I'm expecting an important call. We're trying to set up a big casting thing. It's been so busy. So busy.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
I've heard that things have been really busy lately.
Yeah, they have been. We're casting Crime and Punishment, the TV series, everyone's been on the show. But the season's almost done, finally.
I haven't been on the show yet.
Oh, you haven't been on the show? Well, we need to do something about that, right? Yeah. And I'm just giving all these casting sessions and stuff like that, these workshops. So your headshot, right? And you're going to be doing, what did we say? Is that monologue? Is that?
Whatever you want.
Yeah. Betmore.
It's pronounced Betty.
Betty.
Yeah, like Betty Davis.
Oh, funny.
Yeah.
That's funny. We're casting a role that looks a lot like Betty Davis. It's like, you actually kind of look a little like Betty. You look like a cross between Julianne Moore and Betty Davis. We're looking for someone kind of like that, actually. That's cool. Well, sweet. How about you just launch into the monologue, and we'll talk about me.
Okay, I'll just take a second. That's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, take a second. Cool. You can start right now.
I've never been so afraid of anything in all my life. I'm afraid of us. I'm afraid that you're gonna see the real me and then leave. Because the real me is scary even to me sometimes. And I know that it's codependent and not cool, but I need you.
You done?
No.
Oh.
So I'm asking for you to meet me halfway here. And like literally halfway. Like halfway between 54th and 36th.
Bet, I need to cut you off right now.
Betty.
Betty.
Yeah.
Betty. It's like B-E-T-T. It's like Betty Davis, right?
Yeah, that's how she spelled it.
That's how I should remember. It's
Yeah.
funny, we're casting a role kind of like Betty Davis right now.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah.
Amazing.
But I'm going to give you something. I can tell you're an accomplished actress. I can look at your resume. You have so many. I mean, Upright Citizens Brigade, Second City, Toronto. You're a Canadian.
I'm Canadian.
Great. I can tell you have a lot of training. What I want you to do with that piece, this piece has a lot of air in it. I want you to suck out all the air and just make it tighter.
Okay.
Make it because you're just leaving me hanging a little bit, you know.
Yeah.
And I want you to come back and you would do that. In fact, it would be probably really good for TV and. To that point, I want to, maybe you know, here at Casting Access, I'm teaching 6-week intensive, on-camera intensive. It starts next week. It's 6 weeks. It's not a big time, Tuesday nights, and we work on TV scenes. It's $595, less than $100 a session, and maybe you can be interested in doing that. We can work with you a little bit more on this then.
Do you want me to do the monologue again?
Well, we're really pressed for time. I would love for you to do it, but I just
I
have
thought
all these
I got 8 minutes.
You do. You did. Yeah, I think so. I was a little bit late, but that was beside the point then.
Oh, so, okay.
Yeah, no, wonderful job. Really, really wonderful job. It was very nice meeting you, Betty Moore. And hopefully I'll see you another again. Maybe I'll see you in the session, huh? In the intensive that we're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Good.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. If you want to reach me, you can just send me an email. Anything you're doing, just send me an email. Keep me updated what you're doing, all right? The email's outside on the door. Okay, cool. Wonderful job. Really, really wonderful job. I hope we can see you again, all right? Okay.
To watch the entire 10-episode web series, visit theinfiniteneed.com. And that's the show.